As your party traverses along the countryside, in the distance you see a small town, and one of the buildings which is closest to you seems to be a small moss-covered, overgrown shack. And as you get closer, you see a few people stumble in and out, and you assume that this place is a bar. And you see this weird creaky sign hanging that says, "The Stumbling Wyvern." As you go in, you see a very tired, very old, disheveled barkeep, and you see a few drunk patrons over the side having conversation, one of which is passed out, and you see a few broken stools in the corner. And as you approach the barkeep greets you and says, "Greetings. Did you realize the DM did not plan any of this?" Hello nerds and nerdettes, welcome to Manbrain. So part of the fun of D&D is the random shenanigans that your party will get up to. And I love that very, very much. However, as the DM, it is incredibly difficult to plan for everything, which means you have to set up ways for you to improv. Now, some people do this better, some people do this worse, but it's the skill that you have to have regardless. And today we're going to go over some of the things that I use that help kind of aid in improvising the random minutia that you don't think your party is going to care about. Now, it is worth noting that I have seen some DMs write novel-length guides to entire cities where they plan out every single building with every single NPC, and that's incredibly impressive. That is not going to happen in one of my games. I'm just too lazy for that. So the current system I have kind of put in place is to roll like 4 d10s, and that gives me the name of the building, the general atmosphere, and general characteristics of the building. Now, I used a bar example, but you can use this for hotels, inns, specific things such as like if you need a whole bunch of like fishing places or what have you. Now, I realize I'm not the first person to use tables in a D&D campaign. I'm not even remotely close to the first person. However, what I am saying is that you should make your own tables so that way they are more resonant with you. And here are some general rules of thumb I use to kind of like tailor my tables to me and my campaign. And you can either take them or leave them and see how they apply to your games. So the first general rule of thumb I'm going to give is, this is going to sound a bit like a no-duh, which is the fact that words mean things. And what I mean by this is how you talk is going to be somewhat niche to who you are as a person, and that extends to you as a DM as well. If I have the word rich in one of my tables, that is way too broad for me as an individual, because rich could mean something very different in a kingdom versus a small sailing town. But if I use the word gaudy in a elven kingdom, that might be something that's like gold leaf, or something that is trying to draw in a much more expensive clientele, but in reality it's like very cheap stuff. Or you have a whole bunch of items on the walls that your party might want to try and steal, and then they realize that it's fake stuff. Fun things like that. Or if we use that same example in a fishing town, gaudy might mean a lot of fishing accoutrements, so that way it brings in travelers, or a whole bunch of metal like fishing hooks or anchors or things like that. So that way it's overtly fishing, but like all the stuff is very cheap and not at all precious whatsoever. You have to find ways to kind of put your brain in a specific spot so that way it reduces the friction to improvise the things that help you as a DM, because if you can get immersed into the world, so can your players. Now, that being said, if you do find a whole bunch of words that are very resonant, that brings us to rule number 2, which is don't overdo it. A lot of tables, and a lot of pre-made tables specifically, will either have 20 to 100-ish items on each page because they're trying to cram as much information as possible so that way you feel like you got something out of it. The problem with that, and I just finished a book called The Checklist Manifesto, is after about 10 items, your brain starts to kind of pewter out and it gets overwhelmed, and it actually becomes more of a barrier than it is actually like helpful to you. The general rule of thumb with checklists is you want to have somewhere between 6 to about 9 items. What that does is you have very quick, snappy reference things. So you have that precious time where you're trying to like look down at the paper to get an idea of what this would look like in your head. Say you need a whole bunch of inns, bars, brothels, what have you, depending on your players. You can make more than one checklist, and you can have elven bars, you can have human bars, you can have whatever, you can have an elven fishing town, you can have a boat shop, the world is your oyster. But generally speaking, condense it down to about 6 to 9 items. I do 10 just because that's the closest number. Well, I guess technically there's a D8, so if you do want to do pure structure, you can do a D8. but I just do D10 because I want to have as many permutations as possible. Whenever you do DM something, write it down. If you don't write it down, then you have to re-improv the exact same thing over and over. That then also means that you should have a scratch pad handy, because your scratch pad will be your best friend. And just so that way you don't end up with a whole bunch of the same kind of wooden shack bar with an angry, disheveled barkeep, I generally have a 3-strike policy, so that way you can have a little bit of variety that's kind of sprinkled in just naturally. Now, that kind of covers the improv part of taking what's from the table to your players. Now, that's just going to take a lot of practice, which is perfectly fine. But let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the table itself. A thing that I try to tend to do is have adjectives and verbs on my tables, do not have nouns. The reason being is you're trying to give off the vibe of the place, and you can fill in individual nouns as they come up, because you can say this one NPC that you found like well back, you see her walk in, or you see the one guy that you talked to also walk in, or whatever. But whenever you're trying to get the general vibe and feel of something, you want to know how old something is, what it looks like, and kind of the general energy of all the patrons or the barkeeps or what have you. And nouns don't really give that. Now, there are 2 exceptions to this rule. First being, if you have to name the place. Let's say I have to name a bar. One of those words can be a noun and the other one has to be an adjective or a verb. The sleeping dragon, the stumbling troll, the green giant, or the green dragon. Those are all perfectly fine, as they don't have to mean anything. The other exception is if there is a very specific item or PC that you want your players to interact with. So for example, as you walk into the bar, you see a very large trident hanging on the back wall behind the barkeep. And as you are almost like magnetically pulled to this artifact, you also notice that the eyes of everyone else is also kind of drawn to this with envy. And you see the old lady that you once met first whenever you walked into town in the corner, and she greets you over. Those kinds of things allow fun little side quests or deepens the lore of a given place. With like the trident example, you could have a fight club, you could have this is like a thing that keeps away some creature. I don't know. The world is your oyster. You can do whatever. I will say kind of use that one a little bit more cautiously, just because sometimes, and this has just been my experience, those things sidetrack your players a lot. And if you're just doing like a general campaign, that's perfectly fine. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But if you're trying to do something that's a little bit more goal directed and you have like a time frame, it can be harder to redirect because they want to explore. Now, it is also worth noting that these are not hard and fast rules. These are things that I do that I find that make my games more easy. And every DM is going to have their own bag of tricks. And if you are a DM, make sure to leave those in the comments below. A, I find them interesting, but B, they might help DMs elsewhere. So with that being said, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video. For example, behind the barkeep, you see a trident that is adorned with precious stones, and you get this radiating magic aura from it. And as you look upon it with degrees of lust, envy. Oh, I'm tired. Okay. Cheers. We'll see how much of this stays in during editing.